Over again, we read in the New Testament how Jesus and St. Paul and all of the apostles, in carrying out the ministry of the gospel, ran afoul of the religious, political, and social cultures of their day, and they did so on two levels. One, they did and said things that the culture did not like. And two, they refused to do and say things that the culture demanded. The scribes and Pharisees continually criticized Jesus, for example, for healing on the Sabbath and for refusing to submit to their hypocritical interpretation of the Mosaic law, and for doing and saying things that gave evidence of his divinity, all of which ultimately led to his crucifixion. St. Paul and the other apostles were constantly being beaten and imprisoned and harassed and ultimately martyred for preaching the truth of Christ's death and resurrection. Today's gospel records Jesus' cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem, in which he angered the Jews by not only rebuking them for their chronic desecration of God's house, but by putting legs to that rebuke by overturning their money tables and driving them out. He then compounded their anger by making reference to the destruction of the temple, speaking of his own body and imminent death, but they, of course, took it as a threat to destroy the actual temple, which ultimately became the subject of one of their accusations against him at his mock trial before the Sanhedrin. And notice, in the middle of the cleansing of the temple, the Jews say to him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" Thus it is that St. Paul, writing in today's epistle from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, would say this in verse 22. "For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom." Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. Just as the Jews were constantly trying to sidetrack Jesus with the demand for some new sign, even immediately after he had just performed a miracle in some cases, even in the midst of countless incontrovertible signs, miracles, and wonders that he continually performed, so the Greeks frustrated St. Paul's preaching in Athens by mocking him for professing that Jesus had risen from the dead. These were the same Greeks of whom we read in Acts 17:21, quote, "Now all the Athenians spent their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new." The Jews' long history of associating messianic prophecies with miraculous signs, and the Greeks' long history of philosophical and intellectual pursuits had, by the time of the first century, had a paralytic effect on large numbers of people in their culture in terms of both groups' capacity for hearing and believing the gospel, both as it was personified by Jesus himself and as it was preached by Paul and St. Peter and the rest of the apostles. Notice the rest of Paul's statement. Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. Several verses later, in 1 Corinthians 2:2, St. Paul would say, "I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." The cross was a stumbling block to Jews because of what it represented, an implement of execution in the most horrific and humiliating manner possible, used quite commonly by the Romans to keep a subjugated people in subjugation. The Jews were all too familiar with the sight of men nailed to a cross and hanging naked, bloody, and beaten to a pulp until they mercifully breathed their last. They saw such a one as cursed by God. And so within that context, Jesus' crucifixion and death only confirmed to them, beyond a shadow of doubt, that he could not possibly be the Messiah. The very suggestion was scandalous. Remember, even Peter had taken Jesus to task and rebuked him for the Lord's declaration that he was going to be crucified. The Greeks, on the other hand, steeped as they were in a culture of rationalism and philosophy, and enamored with ideas, with intellectual gymnastics and speculation born of science and of observation of the world around them, they could not be characterized at all as a people of faith, in spite of the fact that they worshipped countless false gods. And so the thought of someone being crucified as a means of bringing new life to the world was to them nonsense, folly, Paul wrote. But Paul goes on in verse 24. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. The power of God and the wisdom of God. So he's saying, this is what the culture wants. Signs and wisdom. But this is what we preach. Christ crucified, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. The power that the Jews wanted to see displayed in signs, and the wisdom that the Greeks were so enamored with, found ultimate expression in Jesus, the Son of the all-powerful, all-wise God. For as Paul goes on to state in verse 25, for the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. You see, Paul was identifying and addressing a problem that existed with so many of both Jews and Greeks of his day. And his point to those who read this letter in Corinth, and his point to us today, is don't be like them. Don't be like them. They were thinking in the context of their cultures rather than in the radical, life-transforming, counter-cultural context of the cross. But then fast forward 2,000 years to our day today. And I believe we can identify a very similar problem among many Christians, including many Catholics. Namely, the problem of a crossless Christianity. A crossless Christianity. Although we might not be able to imagine someone today who identifies himself or herself as a Christian actually admitting that the cross is a stumbling block or folly to them, many of them do so by their behavior, their lifestyles, their thought patterns, and what they support and what they're willing to go along with. By doing so, they have abdicated to the spirit of the age and the culture, which seeks only the power of human striving and of human institutions, and the wisdom of human endeavor that effectively excludes the transcendent. So let me say this plainly. If you are a Christian, if you are a Catholic, and you allow your thinking to be dominated by the prevailing culture, it won't be long before the cross of Christ and its effects will be neutralized in your life, if it hasn't happened already. Catholic politicians and office holders who support the cause of abortion do so because they are wedded to the power that comes from their political party and the votes of their pro-abortion constituents. To them, the cross is a stumbling block, because to acknowledge the cross and pick it up and carry it daily, as Jesus requires, would mean jeopardizing the hold they believe they have on earthly power. Catholics who deny the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist do so because they have bought into the lie that only that which I can see, hear, and feel or prove scientifically is true. Yet to deny the Eucharist is to deny the cross which made it possible, and thus to dismiss both as folly. Catholics who adopt the moral relativism of the world, which says, for example, that there are many ways to heaven, and the cross is but one of them, deny the cross by making the one who died upon it out to be a liar. Catholics who give preference to the popular culture over the commands of God and over the teachings of the Church by espousing the notion that the Church must get with the times by changing her doctrines, deny the cross. Brothers and sisters, our job as faithful Catholics is not to decide what the faith is or should be in every generation. Our job as faithful Catholics is to pass the faith on intact to the next generation. It is emphatically not the Church's role to find a way to affirm what our prevailing culture engages in and celebrates. The fact, for example, that the culture has reached the point of asserting, however aggressively, that two people of the same sex can marry, does not change the truth that marriage is established by God as the indissoluble union of one man and one woman. It is not the Church's job to make people feel good about their choices, if those choices have the potential to cause the loss of their immortal souls. That's not what it means for the Church to be pastoral. That's not what it means for an individual priest to be pastoral. In fact, quite to the contrary. In the words of the great Fulton Sheen, quote, "The truth is the truth, no matter how many people deny it. And a lie is a lie, no matter how many people believe it." End quote. I would submit to you that one of the chief reasons for the chaos, the rot, and the depravity in our culture today is because so many Catholics and other Christians have attempted to adopt a crossless Christianity by abdicating to the power and the wisdom of the world in the way they think, in the way they live, in the way they behave, in the things they choose for entertainment, and in general, the way they relate to the world. Caving in on abortion, on contraception, on euthanasia, on premarital and extramarital sex, on physician-assisted suicide, on same-sex marriage, on gender ideology, and on a whole host of other societal ills, we have denied the cross, settled for earthly power and earthly wisdom in the path of least resistance, and in doing so have contributed mightily to the ultimate corruption and dissolution of our society. And if I may say so, caving into the power and wisdom of the secular authorities in their repressive COVID restrictions on the Church is a denial of the cross, because it has allowed the temporal to displace the eternal. It has allowed the physical to displace the spiritual. Remember that their starting point was that worship of God is not essential. Participation in the Mass and receiving the sacraments is not essential, they told us. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Will we continue to employ common sense measures to protect everyone's health? Of course we will. But we will not deny the cross by allowing the secular authorities to use their power and their wisdom to dictate to our consciences how or if we will worship the God of the universe. We have to ask ourselves how far the secular powers will go in subordinating the rights of the church to the power and wisdom of the state, now that they have had a taste of it. And even as we ask the question, the answer is already becoming clear in, for example, the abomination known euphemistically as the Equality Act, now making its way through the U.S. Congress. In its statement on this bill, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops stated that, quote, "It discriminates against people of faith, threatens unborn life, and undermines the common good." Here are 6 bullet points from that statement by the Bishops' Conference that I want you to pay attention to. Number 1, these are the bishops speaking. The Equality Act exempts itself from the bipartisan Religious Freedom Restoration Act in an explicit and unprecedented departure from one of America's founding principles, thereby infringing on religious freedom and making it more difficult for individuals to live out their faith. Number 2, the Equality Act forces religiously operated spaces and establishments such as church halls to either host functions that violate their beliefs or close their doors to their communities. Number 3, the Equality Act requires women to compete against men and boys in sports and to share locker rooms and shower facilities with men and boys. Number 4, the Equality Act forces faith-based charities that serve all people to violate their religious beliefs and threatens the welfare of thousands of beneficiaries of charitable services, such as shelters and foster care agencies, by forcing a multitude of them to be shut down. Number 5, the Equality Act jeopardizes existing prohibitions on the use of federal taxpayer funds for abortion, likely pressuring or even mandating the performance of abortions by healthcare providers in violation of their consciences and ultimately ending more human lives. Number 6, the Equality Act hinders quality healthcare by forcing healthcare professionals against their best medical judgment to support treatments and procedures associated with gender transitions. The bill was passed, you may be aware, by every single Democrat in the House of Representatives, including, we should add, all 77 Catholics, led by Catholic Nancy Pelosi, and with the full-throated support and endorsement of Catholic President Joe Biden. Its next step is in the Senate, where the hope is it will be defeated. If it passes, it will represent the most aggressive assault on religious liberty in the history of our nation. Brothers and sisters, Lent is a time for rediscovering the cross. But more than that, it is a time for embracing it and appropriating it, both its blessings and its demands, into our lives. St. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:21, quote, "For to this you have been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." End quote. How do we do that? Jesus tells us how. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me." And he says further that if we do not do that, we cannot be his disciples, and we're not even worthy of him. There's an urgency to this message today that I hope you will discern and pay heed to. Take it to heart. The world we live in is becoming more debased and more perilous for Christians by the day. We cannot we must not emulate it. We must not frame our lives around it. Let us rather embrace Christ crucified, so that we can say with St. Paul, "Far be it from me to glory, except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.